It was 6 p.m., the hour when the store filled with people who still had lives to get home to, husbands looking for milk, mothers corralling toddlers, and workers grabbing frozen pizzas. Gideon stood apart from them. He wore a heavy wool coat that had seen better winters and kept his hands buried deep in his pockets. He didn't want anyone to see the tremors. He stood at the meat counter for 10 minutes, just watching. To the average shopper, the display was a sea of red plastic wrap trays. To Gideon, it was a graveyard of missed potential. He saw the poor marbling in the ribeyes and the dull, oxidized hue of the ground chuck. The smell of the place, a mixture of bleach and raw blood, triggered memories he tried to keep buried. Memories of high-end walk-ins, of dry-aged beef that cost a month's rent, and the frantic, rhythmic chorus of "Yes, Chef," that used to be his heartbeat. Finally, his eyes settled on a single New York strip. It was tucked in the back, nearly hidden. It had a thick, creamy fat cap and deep ruby coloring. It was a beautiful piece of meat, far too good for a place like this. "Can I help you?" the butcher asked. He was a kid, maybe 19, with a name tag that read Devon. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "The strip. Third from the left in the back row," Gideon said, sounding like two stones grinding together. Devon reached for a generic, thin cut in the front, his movements lazy and uninspired. "No," Gideon snapped, the authority of the kitchen briefly flashing in his eyes before he checked it. He softened his tone, but the intensity remained. "The one in the back. With the tapered end and the white marbling through the center. That one." The kid pulled it out, weighed it, and slapped a price tag on it. $24.50. Gideon felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had exactly $20 in his pocket, 2 crisp tens he'd saved like a holy relic, and a handful of loose change he'd scrounged from the floorboards of his car, mixed with lint and a few dead matches. "Is that it?" Devon asked, already looking past him at a woman wanting a pound of honey ham. "Yes," Gideon answered. "That's it." He took the package, the cold weight of it pressing against his palm. This was his communion. His final act. He'd spent a decade in the finest kitchens in Chicago, plating dishes that cost more than his current car was worth. He had once been the man who decided which farmers were worthy of supplying his kitchen. Now, he was haggling for a single steak in a store that smelled like floor wax. He walked toward the registers, every step feeling like he was dragging a heavy chain. He passed the produce aisle, noticing the wilted cilantro and the bruised apples. A year ago, he would have called the manager over to berate him for such standards. Today, he just looked down at his scuffed boots. He wasn't that man anymore. That man had died in a kitchen fire that started with a grease trap and ended with a lawsuit that stripped him of his name, his money, and his pride. The line at Register 4 was moving with agonizing slowness. Gideon stared at the back of the person in front of him, a woman with a cart full of kale and bottled water. He felt the eyes of the people behind him, or perhaps he just imagined them. He felt like an intruder in the world of the living. He looked at the items on the conveyor belt, a gallon of milk, a loaf of white bread, a pack of diapers. Life. Simple, continuing life. When it was his turn, the cashier was a girl with dyed blue hair and a bored expression that suggested she'd seen everything and cared about none of it. She scanned the steak with a sharp beep that echoed in Gideon's skull. $24.50, she said, her voice a flat monotone. Gideon pulled out the crumpled tens. He smoothed them out on the belt with trembling fingers, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. Then he began pulling the change from his pocket. Dimes. Nickels. A few sticky pennies. He counted them out one by one, his face turning a hot, stinging red. The silence of the store seemed to amplify the clink of the coins on the plastic surface. 20, 21, 21.50. The line behind him shifted. A man in a suit sighed loudly, a sound of pure, unfiltered annoyance. A woman checked her watch and shifted her weight. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on Gideon's shoulders until he felt like he might collapse right there on the linoleum. "I'm short," Gideon said, his voice barely audible over the beep of the other registers. "I thought I had more in the car." "You need $3 and change, man," the girl said, looking at the pile of coins with disdain. "You want to put it back? I have to call a manager for a void." "No," Gideon said, his fingers twitching toward the steak. "I need this." It wasn't just a steak. It was the only thing he had left that reminded him of who he used to be. It was the centerpiece of the only ritual he had left. He had planned the evening out: the cast iron skillet, the salt, the butter, the silence. After that, he didn't have a plan. He didn't want a plan. "Look, you're holding up the line," the girl said, her hand reaching for the intercom. Suddenly, a hand reached over Gideon's shoulder. It was a rough, calloused hand with dirt under the nails and skin that looked like worn leather. A $5 bill was dropped onto the counter. It wasn't crisp, it was soft and smelled like wood smoke. "Keep the change, sweetheart," a voice growled. It was a deep, gravelly sound, like tires on a gravel road. Gideon turned. Standing behind him was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of an oak tree. He didn't look at Gideon, he just stared at the cashier until she processed the payment. "I can't take this," Gideon said, his pride flaring up like a dying ember. "You already did," the man said. "Now move along. People got places to be, and I'm hungry." The girl shoved the steak into a thin brown bag. Gideon took it, his heart hammering against his ribs. He walked out of the store without looking back, the cool evening air hitting his face like a slap. The air outside was biting, the kind of damp cold that gets into your bones. Gideon stood by his beat-up sedan, clutching the brown paper bag to his chest. He felt sick. The kindness of the stranger felt like a brand. He was a charity case now. A man who couldn't even pay for his own exit. He threw the bag onto the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, staring at the dash. He thought about his apartment, a studio with a kitchenette that barely worked and a window that looked out onto an alleyway. He thought about the bottle of cheap bourbon waiting on the counter. "Hey, chef." Gideon froze. The voice was the same one from the register. He hadn't heard the man follow him out. The stranger was standing a few feet away, leaning against a rusted-out Ford truck, lighting an old wooden pipe. The smoke drifted toward Gideon, a heavy scent of cherry wood and tobacco. "You got the wrong guy," Gideon said, fumbling for his keys, his voice defensive and sharp. "I don't think so," the man said. He walked closer, his boots heavy on the asphalt. "I watched you back there. You didn't just look at that piece of meat. You appraised it. You looked at the marbling like it was a map of a country you used to rule. Only one kind of person does that." Gideon finally looked at him. The man had sharp, intelligent eyes buried under heavy brows. He looked like he knew things Gideon didn't want to admit. "I used to be a lot of things," Gideon said, finally starting the car. The engine groaned and sputtered. "Now I'm just a guy who can't afford dinner. Thanks for the $5. I'll mail it to you if I ever see $5 again." "My name's Roscoe," the man said, ignoring the hostility. "And I know a man who's planning a final meal when I see one." "You got that look in your eye, son. Like you're just waiting for the clock to run out and you want to taste something real before it does." "What do you want, Roscoe? You want to give me a lecture?" Roscoe laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "I want to know why a man with hands like yours, hands that know how to handle a knife, is wasting his time buying one steak when he could be searing 50 of them a night. I own a place across town. The Rusty Spoon. It's a dive and it's mine. Or it was mine. The bank is breathing down my neck because the food is garbage and the town has forgotten we exist. My last cook quit because he couldn't stay sober enough to flip a burger." "I told you, I don't cook anymore," Gideon said, gripping the steering wheel. "That's a lie," Roscoe said, stepping forward so he was right at the window. "You're a cook until they put you in the ground. It's a sickness. You can't look at a tomato without wondering how to salt it. You want to eat that steak alone in a dark apartment and call it a day? Fine. That's your choice. Or you can come by tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. See the kitchen. If it's as bad as you think it is, you can walk away. But at least you'll have died with a spatula in your hand instead of a grudge." Roscoe didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked back to his truck. He tossed a small scrap of paper through Gideon's open window. It landed on the seat next to the steak. An address. Gideon drove home in a daze. He got to his apartment and did exactly what he planned. He salted the steak. He let it sit. He got the pan screaming hot. The smell of the searing fat should have made him happy, but it just felt like a haunting. Every sizzle sounded like the fire that took his life away. He ate it in 3 minutes, standing up. It was the best thing he'd tasted in a year, and it tasted like ash. He looked at the address on the counter. He looked at the bottle of bourbon. He didn't reach for the glass. He reached for his knife roll, tucked away in the back of the closet, covered in dust. He unrolled it. The steel was dull, but the weight was familiar. He didn't sleep. He spent the night with a whetstone. By 5:30 a.m., the edge was sharp enough to split a hair. He walked out the door, the knife roll tucked under his arm like a soldier's rifle. The morning was a bruised purple color, the kind of light that makes everything look colder than it actually is. Gideon pulled his car into the gravel lot of the Rusty Spoon at exactly 5:58 a.m. The neon sign above the door was missing the and the Y, so it just blinked the UST Spoon in a sickly yellow rhythm. It sat between a shuttered laundromat and a vacant lot filled with waist-high weeds. Gideon sat in his car for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. He gripped his knife roll. His hands were steady for the first time in months. The whetstone work from the night before had been a form of prayer, a way to sharpen his own mind along with the steel. He stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under his boots, a loud, lonely sound in the pre-dawn silence. He pushed open the heavy wooden door. A bell chimed, a tinny, pathetic sound. Inside, the diner smelled of stale grease, cold coffee, and the lingering ghost of 1,000 cigarettes. Roscoe was behind the counter, wearing a clean but faded apron. He was wiping down a mug with a rag that should have been retired months ago. He looked up, and for a second, a spark of genuine surprise crossed his weathered face. "You're late," Roscoe grunted, though his eyes said something else. "By about 30 seconds. "I was deciding if I should drive into a bridge instead," Gideon said, walking toward the counter. He didn't take off his coat. He just looked around. The vinyl booths were cracked, held together by strips of silver duct tape that looked like scars. The floor was a checkerboard of linoleum that had been scrubbed so many times the pattern was fading into a dull gray. It was a place where people came to be forgotten, not to be fed. "Kitchens through the swing doors," Roscoe said, gesturing with his chin. "I haven't touched it since the last guy walked out. He left a mess. If you've got a stomach for it, go have a look." Gideon didn't say a word. He walked past the counter and pushed through the double doors. The kitchen was a disaster. It was smaller than Gideon's walk-in at his old restaurant, and it was twice as filthy. A layer of yellowed grease coated the hood vents. The flat-top grill was black with carbon buildup. In the corner, a stack of plastic bins held produce that was well on its way to becoming compost. Gideon felt a surge of familiar rage. It was the chef's rage, the cold, focused anger that comes when a kitchen is disrespected. He dropped his knife roll on a stainless steel prep table that rocked on uneven legs. He opened the reach-in cooler. Inside, he found a gallon of milk past its date, a tray of graying burger patties, and a tub of special sauce that had separated into a disturbing oily film. "This isn't a kitchen," Gideon muttered to the empty room. "It's a crime scene." He heard the doors creak open behind him. Roscoe stood there, leaning against the frame, his pipe unlit in his mouth. "Like I said, the bank is coming. They don't care about the grease. They care about the ledger. But nobody comes in for a burger if the burger tastes like despair. I've got enough in the account for one last supply run. One. If we don't turn a profit by Friday, I'm locking the doors for good." Gideon turned around, his eyes hard. "You want me to save this?" With a broken grill and rotten meat. I want to see if you're as good as your eyes said you were back at the grocery store, Roscoe challenged. Any hack can cook with a $5,000 range and a sous chef to prep his onions. It takes a real man to make something out of nothing. Gideon looked at his knife roll. He looked at his own hands, the scars on his knuckles from years of burns and slips. He thought about the fire that had ended his career. He had let the flames win for a long time. I need bleach, Gideon said. Lots of it. I need steel wool, a scraper, and a power wash if you can find one. And I need you to stay out of my way. Roscoe smiled, a slow, creaky movement of his cheeks. The cleaning supplies are in the back closet. I'll go get the truck warmed up for the market. What are we buying? We aren't buying anything yet, Gideon said, stripping off his heavy coat to reveal a stained white t-shirt. He looked like a man preparing for a fight. I don't cook in filth. Go get the bleach. By 11 a.m., the kitchen didn't look new, but it looked honest. Gideon had spent 4 hours on his knees, scrubbing the floors and the equipment until his fingernails were raw. The flat top was now a dull silver, the carbon scraped away to reveal the metal beneath. The vents were clear. The air no longer smelled like old oil, it smelled like lemons and hard work. Roscoe returned with a modest haul from a local butcher and a farm stand, items Gideon had barked at him over the phone. No more frozen patties. No more bagged lettuce. The lunch rush at the Rusty Spoon was usually 3 old men and a confused trucker. But today, word had seemingly traveled through the small town that something was happening. A few more cars pulled into the gravel. Gideon stood at the pass, his knives laid out on a clean towel. His first order came in, 2 cheeseburgers well done, and a side of fries. It was the simplest order in the world. To the old Gideon, it would have been an insult. To this Gideon, it was a test. He took the fresh ground beef, a blend of chuck and brisket he'd made Roscoe wait for at the butcher's, and formed the patties by hand. He didn't press them. He didn't maltreat the meat. He seasoned them heavily with salt and cracked pepper. When the meat hit the hot steel, the sound was like an ovation. The smell, clean, searing beef, wafted out into the dining room. He toasted the buns with a brush of clarified butter. He sliced the onions paper-thin, so they would provide a crunch without overpowering the palate. Roscoe took the plates out to a booth where 2 construction workers sat. Gideon watched through the small window in the door. The men didn't talk. They took their first bites. One of them stopped chewing, looked at the burger, and then looked at his partner. He nodded once, a slow, profound movement, and then went back in for a larger bite. Gideon felt a lump in his throat. He went back to the prep table and started dicing onions for the evening soup. His movements were fluid, the knife an extension of his arm. He wasn't thinking about the lawsuit. He wasn't thinking about the fire. He was thinking about the grain of the onion and the heat of the grill. They're asking who's in the back, Roscoe said, popping his head into the kitchen. He looked younger than he had that morning. I told them it was a ghost. Tell them to keep eating, Gideon said, not looking up. The soup will be ready in 20 minutes. As the lunch rush ended, Gideon sat on a milk crate in the back alley, taking his first break. He looked at his hands. They were covered in grease and salt. They were beautiful. But as he sat there, a black sedan pulled into the lot. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase. He looked at the blinking neon sign and shook his head. The bank had arrived. The man in the gray suit didn't belong in a place that smelled like floor wax and frying onions. He walked into the diner with a gait that suggested he was afraid of catching something from the upholstery. He didn't sit in a booth, he stood at the counter and tapped a silver pen against a leather-bound folder. Gideon watched him through the pass-through window. The chef's rage from earlier had cooled into something sharper, a defensive instinct. This was the same kind of man who had sat across from Gideon during the depositions, the kind of man who used numbers to erase people. Roscoe, the man said, his voice clipped and professional. I'm Marcus Thorne. We spoke on the phone. Multiple times. Roscoe wiped his hands on his apron and stepped up to the counter. He looked smaller next to Thorn, but he didn't back down. I told you I'd have an answer for you by Friday, Thorn. It's only Wednesday. The bank doesn't need an answer, Roscoe. They need a payment. Or a signature on the foreclosure surrender, Thorn said, sliding a document across the faded laminate. The property has been appraised. The lot is worth more than the business. We have a developer interested in putting a car wash here. It's over. Gideon stepped out from the kitchen. He was still wearing his apron, his forearms dusted with flour and a smudge of soot on his cheek. He looked like a man who had just come out of a coal mine, but he held himself with the posture of a king. The kitchen is open, Gideon said, his voice cutting through Thorn's corporate drone. If you're sitting at the counter, you're a customer. If you're not a customer, you're loitering. Thorn looked at Gideon, squinting. And who are you? The janitor? I'm the reason this place isn't going to be a car wash, Gideon said. He looked at Roscoe. Give him a menu. On the house. I don't want a menu, Thorn scoffed. I want this signature. Eat the food, Thorn, Roscoe said, a new grit in his voice. If you still want to shut us down after you eat, I'll sign the paper. But you don't close a man's life on an empty stomach. That's bad business. Thorn looked at his watch, then at the grease-stained walls. He sighed and sat on a swivel stool. Fine. 5 minutes. Bring me whatever is fastest. Fastest isn't what we do here, Gideon said, retreating into the kitchen. I'll bring you what you need. In the kitchen, Gideon moved with a terrifying focus. This wasn't just a meal, it was a closing argument. He didn't reach for the burger meat. He reached for the last of the fresh ingredients Roscoe had brought in, a small, perfect portion of trout and some wild mushrooms. He worked the pan with a rhythmic flick of his wrist. The butter foamed and turned nutty and brown. He basted the fish, the skin crisping into a golden, glass-like sheet. He didn't use a timer. He listened to the sizzle. He smelled the exact moment the protein was ready to flake. He plated the dish on a chipped white plate, but he treated the arrangement like it was fine china. A sprig of fresh herbs, a reduction of lemon and butter, a scatter of perfectly sautéed mushrooms. It was a dish that belonged in a 3-star restaurant in the city, served in a room where the air was thick. He walked the plate out himself. He set it down in front of Thorn without a word. Thorn looked at the plate. He looked at the way the light hit the fish. He picked up a fork, his expression one of deep skepticism. He took a bite. The silence that followed was long. Thorn chewed slowly. He took another bite. Then another. He forgot about his silver pen. He forgot about his leather folder. For a moment, the man in the suit disappeared, replaced by a human being who was experiencing something genuine. Where did you learn to do this? Thorn asked, his voice lower now, devoid of the corporate edge. In a place that burned down, Gideon said. But the recipes survived. Thorn finished the plate. He wiped his mouth with a paper napkin and looked at the foreclosure papers. He looked at Roscoe, then at Gideon. This is exceptional, Thorn admitted. He looked pained to say it. But exceptional food doesn't pay a mortgage. You need volume. You need a crowd. The crowd is coming, Roscoe said, pointing toward the window. 2 more cars had pulled into the gravel lot. Then a truck. Then another. The construction workers from lunch had told their friends. The local sheriff was stepping out of his cruiser. The smell of Gideon's cooking had acted like a beacon, pulling the town out of its slumber. Thorn looked at the door as the bell chimed, a steady, repetitive ring. I can give you 30 days, he muttered, sliding the folder back into his briefcase. A stay of execution. If the numbers look different by the end of the month, the bank might reconsider the car wash. But don't make me look like a fool. I don't have time to make you look like anything, Gideon said, turning back toward the kitchen as the first order of the night was shouted out. I've got a line forming. 3 weeks later, the Rusty Spoon was no longer a dive. It was a destination. The R and the Y in the sign were still missing, but no one cared. The parking lot was full every night. People were driving from 3 towns over to try the Ghost Chef's nightly specials. Gideon stood at the prep table, his movements a blur of efficiency. He wasn't the man who had stood at the grocery counter with a handful of sticky pennies. His coat was still old, but his apron was white and stiff with starch. The tremors in his hands were gone, replaced by the steady, certain strength of a man who knew exactly where the blade needed to go. Roscoe walked into the kitchen, carrying a crate of fresh produce. He looked 10 years younger. He leaned against the table and watched Gideon work for a moment. "The bank sent a letter today," Roscoe said. "The loan is current. They even offered us a line of credit for renovations." "Tell them to keep it," Gideon said, dicing a red pepper with a speed that made the air hum. "We don't need their renovations. We need a new stove and a bigger walk-in. The rest of this place stays exactly how it is. It's got character." Roscoe chuckled. "I never did ask you. That night at the store, why that steak? Why that night?" Gideon stopped cutting. He looked at his knife, the steel gleaming under the clean kitchen lights. He thought about the dark apartment and the bottle of bourbon. He thought about the bridge he hadn't driven into. "I was looking for an ending," Gideon said quietly. "I didn't realize I was just shopping for a new beginning." "Well," Roscoe said, patting him on the shoulder, "don't get too philosophical. You've got 6 orders of the trout and a table of 8 asking for the ribeye. And the sheriff wants to know if you can make those little lemon tarts again." Gideon felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth, a real one this time. He picked up his pan and moved toward the heat. "Tell the sheriff to wait his turn," Gideon said. "The kitchen is in charge here." The bell at the door chimed. The dining room was loud with the sound of clinking silverware and human voices. Out in the parking lot, the sun was setting, casting long, golden light across the gravel. Gideon didn't look at the shadows. He looked at the fire on the stove, and for the first time since the fire, he wasn't afraid of the flames. Gideon didn't just find a job at the Rusty Spoon. He found a reason to wake up before the sun. He learned that while fire can take your name and your money, it can't take the callus on your hands or the instinct in your soul. Most people walk through life looking for a handout, but sometimes all you really need is a hand up, and a stranger who sees the person you used to be, even when you've forgotten yourself. If this story reminded you that it's never too late for a second act, hit that like button and let us know in the comments if you've ever had someone who stepped in right when you were at your lowest. We want to hear your stories below. And if you want more tales that stir the soul and prove the human spirit is tougher than any hardship, make sure to subscribe to Soulstir Stories. Don't forget to turn on the bell so you never miss a new chapter. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.